I've never given this lecture before, but and I really loathe that I keep making reference to current politics. That's not how I like to run my classes, but it would seem irresponsible to talk about disasters without acknowledging what's been happening the last few months in the wholesale change of our government. So I just wanted to say where we are here, and then we'll pivot to a positive thing. I don't want to leave you guys on a negative note. But as wide-eyed professionals, I think it is important that we talk about this stuff. We already talked about the definition of disasters. So in general, what seems to be happening is a wholesale active dismantling of a lot of our government structures, and in particular stuff that impact the types of things we've been talking about this semester. We've talked about some of these things already in this class, but we've seen a dramatic reduction in the amount of money available to emergency aid in many different forms, many different places, many different programs, et cetera. And we've seen, along with the reduction in aid, just this lack of attention to things like FEMA and lack of robust leadership from some professionals that historically would staff these types of positions in a federal administration. And then cutbacks across many agencies, not just FEMA, but many other agencies that support the work of disaster planning, response, recovery, all that kind of stuff. So some examples. And now some of these things we've talked about, some of these we haven't. So the first I have listed here is the Myanmar earthquake, which we spent a fair amount of time going over in terms of the context and the history. And so when I gave that lecture, we were just starting, right? It was it was very soon after that event happened, and I was optimistic that, hey, maybe we're going to note that there was a problem and sort of right the ship. Unfortunately, I'm very disappointed to say we did not really change the response from what we talked about before. Essentially, we saw delayed and effectively non-existent, by any real measure, U.S. response, despite that huge, massive earthquake in Southeast Asia. And in fact, some USAID employees actually got termination letters in the hours after the onset of the earthquake. I mean, this is just nuts. This is totally nuts. And these are the folks that would have, that in a normal setting would have responded and been, boots on the ground kind of stuff, helping out. We pledged in the initial weeks only $2 million. And as far as I can tell, maybe you guys have seen something that I haven't, but as far as I can tell, we haven't pledged anything else. So I'll just say that again. Massive, massive earthquake. We've given pennies on the dollar compared to what we historically have provided, either with in-kind services or with direct financial support and aid. And that compares to, in the first few weeks alone, almost $14 million from China. Now, obviously, China is a neighbor, but even so, that's a massive gap. And so while it's, as we talked about in that lecture, it's still a little hard to tell because the government is fairly restrictive in terms of media outlets and stuff, but it certainly appears to be a much higher mortality. I think it's reasonable to say that we probably had higher mortality in the wake of this because we didn't have the types of resources that we would surge in historically. And we've essentially given away the leadership in terms of disaster to China in this particular case. I'm sure there will be much more detailed studies that will come out in the coming years that more precisely talk about how much higher the mortality was and everything, but I think it's reasonable to say that there's higher. Any questions about that? No, okay. We can talk about what's been going on in response to our wildfires, the LA and the greater LA wildfires that broke out in January 2025 during those extraordinary, particularly strong Santa Ana events. And first and foremost, the president said, maybe we're not going to give you FEMA aid, right? Which is nuts. And it was like almost like a political battle to get it done. During some of the firefights, some of the troops that were helping to do some of the management, security, et cetera, were redirected to the border to deal with immigration. As we also mentioned, the president wasted, there's no other word for it, wasted about 2.2 billion gallons of water for reasons I do not understand, and I don't want to be disparaging to anybody, but they sound mentally unhinged. Argued that the reason why the Palisades fire got so bad is because there, quote unquote, wasn't water in the fire hydrants. There wasn't water in the fire hydrants because the system was so old and was not designed to run that much water under that type of pressure for that many hours. But there was plenty of water in the regional water system. But so to prove his point, he went and he released a bunch of water in the Central Valley, which is not connected at all to the LA system, and gave the managers only a few hours of notice. Normally, if we were to do something like this, we'd talk with the water districts for weeks ahead of time, get everybody prepared, get everybody out of the riverbed, just released it. But it clearly worked because different people I know around the country have said, yeah, the president's fixing the water situation. And they specifically sent the social media pictures of the water flowing out as evidence that the problem was fixed, which it was completely fallacious and did nothing to help us. So that was that. And then as I believe I mentioned to you guys, we had some of your colleagues, some of your previous ESRM alum that graduated and are working for organizations like the National Park Service. All the National Park Service folks are trained to be emergency responders for things like wildfires. They're not firefighters, quote unquote, but in an emergency situation, they're all prepared to help with fire response and stuff. And in the case of some of your alumni, they included people that are particular experts on vegetation management, invasive species management ever. And so one person I can think of in particular was deployed to the fire recovery. And he spent several weeks working on the fire recovery down in LA, and came home on Thursday, got an email on Friday, and was fired. And so that's not the way I would suggest that we robustly respond to fires. Does anybody know of some other examples or other dimensions of, maybe there's something I missed, maybe there's something good that's happening? Does anybody know of any good responses or other bad responses in the wake of the LA fires? Like from a policy, federal type of level? No, everybody's so talkative today. Everybody's very engaged. Okay. If we talk about the Maui wildfire recovery, now this fire happened in August of 2023, so clearly this had not happened in the last few months, but the recovery is still ongoing. And some examples of what the administration has done is, so we're at the stage now where housing and urban development is playing a large role in terms of the recovery. So as I mentioned to you guys when we were there with some of you actually in the room, when we were there doing our recovery work in January, for the most part, the cleanup is done. The broken materials and the scraped pipes and all that kind of stuff, that's mostly done. So now we're into the rebuilding phase. And so that's where we can use the assistance from housing and urban development. And they basically froze funding for a while because the so-called DOGE folks needed to do some checks and make sure, an 18-year-old that likes to Google stuff and put stuff through AI is, meets his standards, right? That kind of stuff. And so this is basically just delayed payments. I don't know of any payments that were canceled. Maybe some of you do, but I don't know of any payments, but certainly delayed. And then the layoff of staff has definitely hindered the recovery, right? When you don't know who to call anymore because that person is no longer in the office. So that was going on. So we can talk about the hurricane season. We're coming up to hurricane season. These, budget cuts have stalled some of the pre-planning and the staging of stuff that we typically do before the season hits. Some states have pause certain resiliency projects because they were waiting for federal funds, and those funds either were actively cut off, or there was so much uncertainty they didn't want to go forward. Because if a state or a local agency, or you guys, so if we pay you guys, right, if you guys are on one of my grants and I pay you $10,000, that's cool, you get paid, you have the check. But then, and so how it typically works is I pay you, or I don't pay you, but you know, the university writes you a check, and you're cool, and then the university accrues all these bills, right? And then every month or every quarter, every 6 months, it depends on how the grant works, at some point in time, then they go, okay, they go to the funder and they go, hey, yo, we spent whatever, $60,000. So can you free us up the money? That's usually how it works. Every once in a while, a foundation will just go, like the McKinsey Scott Foundation, like, here's like $1 million. Do it and just give you the check, and then we administer it all internally. But that's usually not how contracting works. We have to show them receipts. We have to make progress. We have to show them we spent. I have to send them a check pay stub from you guys showing that we paid you or whatever. And so because of that, even for the projects that weren't halted, a lot of small jurisdictions that don't have extra money they can just use for, like, or freaked out that, hey, maybe we're going to do this, and then we're going to turn the receipts in 3 months, and they're going to go, nope, we're not going to pay it. So that, just the threat of that has stalled stuff. And I would argue that NOAA is deeply unprepared compared to past years. And it's unclear what we're going to do if a hurricane were to hit, to be totally honest. So we had our field trip to the National Weather Service's office in Oxnard. And folks that deal with weather and satellite monitoring and stuff like that, we fired at least 600 folks. There's likely to be many more, but for now, 600 folks. And 1 in 4 of the offices around the weather forecasting offices around the country lacks senior forecasters, right? That's not to say the folks that are there, the junior folks, aren't good, but you want to have the old farts around, right? You want to have the folks that have experience, that know how to, that have seen this before. And so that's very concerning. In particular, there's been a lot of press about the balloon. These are done all around, but in particular, they're done in places, especially in places like Alaska and places like that we don't have robust other networks and have more complicated, higher atmospheric stuff. And so we've started cutting those launches to get real-time information on things like the jet stream and things of that nature. That's a problem. And as we mentioned before, there's this fear of privatization and this desire of the current administration to not give you free public data, but to somehow give that data only to private operators, and then you would pay them for it. And we talked about the dangers where we have some evidence now of some of those folks actually not providing warnings to people because they didn't pay them, and having tornadoes and things strike their farms and stuff. We talked about the bird flu. So stuff going on there. We have a lot of USDA staff that have been laid off. And on our county, we have 6 USDA soil conservation service related employees. We fired 3 of them, 3 of the 6. Rehired, I think, 1.5 of those, but still it's a problem. And that's going on and that was for folks that primarily don't deal with bird flu. Similar things have been happening with people that do deal with the infection. I just saw a story that I don't know if I put it in Scoop It or not. Did you guys see the story about the 75 job offerings or 80 job offerings? Maybe I didn't post that to you guys. So long story short is they fired all these folks that do inspections of crops and animals, right? And then they realized, yeah, I guess we do need to see if there's like disease in this cattle or whatever. Like, actually, can you guys come back to work, or not come back to work, but here's some jobs. Anybody want to work for this job? I'll just ask, are you guys down with a federal position right now? Would you guys be down to get a federal position right now? Maybe some, little bit, maybe 1 or 2, maybe. You guys are super talk. I can't hear. You guys, please speak one at a time. I can't hear. So is anybody still interested in a federal job, like in the near term? No. So let me say, in fall, was anybody potentially interested in a federal job with a federal agency or something? Yeah, put your hand up if that's. So it looks like maybe about like 20% of you guys, 20, a third maybe were, but nobody sounds like they're interested now. I mean, you guys do what you got to do. If there's a job and you guys think you need a job, go for it. But I don't think, unfortunately, in the near term, I don't know how secure such positions would be. I think that's an objective statement to say. We've shut down some of our, because of the staffing issue and stuff, we've shut down some of our USDA labs that do and other health and human services related stuff that do specific testing for certain substances, contaminants, toxins, et cetera, and also things related to bird flu. And so that means that we can't diagnose infections as much or spread as much, et cetera. When we have in some cases, like I mentioned, there has been a realization that, oh my gosh, we need to get these guys back, but they have not, or the rehiring takes a while. And effectively, I would argue the outbreaks in many cases seems, not everywhere, but in many places seems to be spreading unchecked. And the only response is basically to cull the flocks when a place is infected. And as I think I played a quote for you guys before, but the Secretary of Health and Human Services has actively mused, maybe we should just let it run its course. Maybe the best thing for this pandemic is just let everything die. And then the things that survive will be resistant, is supposedly the argument, which is, again, batty. The measles epidemic is going on. CDC has clearly been gutted, lots and lots of cuts. Where we stand as of last week or so, we have more than 900 reported cases. Again, our monitoring network is not as robust as it could be. We've had several deaths of young children. That whole lecture, we talked about some of that. And then we've actually now have some evidence of some local vaccine programs in places like Dallas, et cetera, just could not operate because they historically were supported by the CDC and their vaccine arms of the Health and Human Services, and that money is not coming with the current leadership. They don't believe in that. And perhaps most scary, the misinformation is running rampant, and folks are not able to. The robust federal scientists that typically speak to public health concerns have mostly been muzzled and not allowed to go to meetings and things of that nature. And so the anti-vaccine message, the propaganda machine is going unchecked, but that's a problem. In our broader part of the country, the broader Western U.S., our wildfire preparation, several fuel management projects to deal with woodlands or shrublands or grasslands have been suspended for the same reasons we mentioned before. Either they were actively cut or there's been such uncertainty about how to do them. They've not gone forward, and people have opted to delay them, at least for now. I mentioned before those layoffs with the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service have reduced some of our ability to respond to controlled burns. And the way the controlled burns go, we have to have everything in place before we start them. And so if there's any concern about weather, about emergency response, we won't go through with it. So this has definitely impacted the comfort level, in particular, of people willing to do these burns. And that's most conspicuously impacting farther away, more rural communities as opposed to sort of urban cores and stuff. We're also seeing impacts on our traditional efforts to deal with famine in places where they're experiencing drought, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, right now. And so we've had more than $1.3 billion cut to USAID that help support these food programs and get people not just food in their bellies, which is super important, but also some programs to help build resilience so that folks can grow their own food, and that even with this drought, they can still put in drought-resistant crops and stuff. That's all been cut. And the World Food Program, which is the UN's entity, just like WHO, we are historically the major funder of that, and we've deeply pulled out of that. Normally USAID funds that type of stuff, and people have described it as a death sentence for millions of folks that are either starving right now or very close to hunger. And essentially nobody's filling this void except in certain areas, in certain strategic areas, Russia and China that have political interest, they are stepping in there at least a little bit. Not to the same magnitude, but again, we're stepping away from the world stage.